Owning just 0.009 Bitcoin is actually a huge deal. You may not believe me yet, but my goal by the end of this video is to prove to you that you have not missed the boat on Bitcoin, and owning just 0.009 Bitcoin is actually massive. The most persistent question and frustration I see in crypto is over how high the price of one Bitcoin has already gone, with the price now sitting at between $60,000 and $70,000 per coin. A lot of investors, especially if you're new to the space, believe that becoming a whole coiner or owning just one Bitcoin is now unattainable. Cost of living has exploded around the world, house prices have skyrocketed, rents are through the roof, and inflation is nuts. So the criticism is a fair one. But in this video, I'm going to put your mind at ease, and I'm going to break down with charts, facts, and logic why owning just a fraction of a Bitcoin, so just 0.009 Bitcoin, or at a stretch 0.1 Bitcoin, is actually an impressive and attainable goal. And make sure to stick around to the end of the video, where I consult with expert and veteran investors in the space to break down the most realistic Bitcoin price prediction over the next 10 to 20 years in fiat money terms. Now, to understand why owning small denominations of Bitcoin in the future will be a massive deal, we need to understand two things. Firstly, we need to understand the true supply of Bitcoin, and secondly, we need to understand the wealth distribution of the world. So first off, as you probably know, there can only ever be a maximum of 21 million Bitcoin ever created. And contrary to what elite bankers would tell you, like Jamie Dimon, this is enforced by the Bitcoin code, which is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to change.
I think there's a good chance that when we get to that 20 million Bitcoins,
they go to 42.
No, that Satoshi's going to come on there, laugh hysterically, go quiet, and all Bitcoin's going to be erased.
I think, man.
How the hell do you know it's going to stop at 21?
These days, there are thousands and thousands of Bitcoin nodes and individuals who are all enforcing the original code that Satoshi Nakamoto laid out in his original white paper. Changing the 21 million Bitcoin supply cap 15 years into Bitcoin is in just no way feasible, and is secured by too many economic incentives. The miners that mine the Bitcoin, the individuals that hold the Bitcoin, and the participants in the Bitcoin network have no reason at all to devalue the currency they own. So we have a base supply of 21 million Bitcoin. However, and this is where it gets juicy, there's a little kept secret that already about 4 million Bitcoin are already permanently lost. Permanently lost Bitcoin happens in a few different scenarios. Someone may have forgotten their private keys, they may have forgotten the password to the computer or device that their Bitcoin is held on, or in some cases they may have sent their Bitcoin to a wrong address and it can no longer be accessed. Measuring the exact amount of Bitcoin permanently lost is more of an art than a science. On the high end, some experts and analysts estimate that around 6 million Bitcoin have been permanently lost to time, whereas on the low end, some experts think that it's closer to 3 million. It all depends on what point you consider a Bitcoin to be lost forever. Some analysts consider a coin to be lost forever when it hasn't been moved in over 7 years or multiple cycles. Some other analysts consider a coin to be permanently lost if it hasn't moved for over 10 years. A safe estimate as to how many Bitcoin have been permanently lost to time on the more conservative side is around 4 million Bitcoin, and the large majority of this is made up by what is thought to be Satoshi Nakamoto's original wallet, which holds over 1.1 million Bitcoin. This Bitcoin hasn't been moved since essentially Bitcoin's inception. And one more morbid point that I will make is that this permanently lost amount of Bitcoin is only going to increase over time. As Bitcoin holders age, some are going to pass away, and they're not going to leave instructions or their key phrases to families or loved ones so they can access their Bitcoin. Essentially, they're going to take their Bitcoin with them. On top of this, human error is always going to be a thing. People are always going to forget their key phrases, they're always going to forget their passwords, and they're always going to accidentally send their Bitcoin to wrong addresses. So this amount of Bitcoin that is permanently lost is only going to increase over time. So we have a total supply cap of 21 million maximum Bitcoin, but already our best guess is that 4 million of these Bitcoin are already permanently lost. This leaves us with only 17 million Bitcoin in the available supply. Now, a figure that a lot of people obsess over is becoming a whole coiner. This means holding one whole Bitcoin. There's a belief that this will put you into the most wealthy cohort of a future Bitcoin society. And to be fair, there is some logic to this that we will get to. But with Bitcoin floating around $60,000 to $70,000 at the time of this recording, this can be extremely demotivating to newer investors who believe that they'll never get to be a whole Bitcoiner. They'll simply never be able to afford one whole Bitcoin. To put aside enough money to buy even just 0.1 Bitcoin is a significant amount of money for most people to first save and then allocate towards investing, especially with the cost of living these days and inflation. However, let's break down with math and a few different scenarios why owning just a fraction of Bitcoin, like 0.009 Bitcoin, is still actually a really big deal. First off, let's look at the cold hard numbers. We know that there can only ever be a total of 21 million Bitcoin created, and already 4 million of these Bitcoin are permanently lost. This leaves us with just 17 million Bitcoin. Right now, today, there's an estimated 50 million people around the world who own at least some Bitcoin. It's also very well agreed amongst experts and analysts that Bitcoin is still very early along in its adoption curve. And if it follows the normal adoption S-curves that we've seen in other technologies, we're going to see the bulk of the adoption over the next 10 to 20 years. So let's now consider the scenario in the future, say 10 to 20 years, in which Bitcoin has reached 25% global adoption. This means 2 billion people will want to own Bitcoin. In this scenario, with only 17 million Bitcoin available, if all 2 billion people wanted exposure to Bitcoin, at best they could only accumulate 0.0085 Bitcoin each. And this is assuming a complete even split of the Bitcoin, which of course is unrealistic, as there's always going to be whales that are going to hold more of the supply. Which means getting to 0.009 Bitcoin would put you well and truly in the above average category of Bitcoin holders. And at today's prices, 0.009 Bitcoin is roughly $500 US, so it's definitely an attainable goal, even if it takes you some time to accumulate. By looking at Bitcoin and reframing it in these terms, owning just a fraction of a Bitcoin is still significant, even at just 0.009 Bitcoin. Now, even though I do think that is a realistic scenario, let's say it's completely unreasonable and we'll never get to 25% global adoption of Bitcoin and 2 billion people will never actually want to own Bitcoin. Fair enough. Let's discount the entire scenario and say that Bitcoin only ever gets to 2% global adoption. This means around the entire globe, only 2% of the total population wants to hold or have exposure to Bitcoin. At the current population today, that would still equal 160 million individual people who want to hold Bitcoin. This is why the 0.1 Bitcoin goal is so highly covered and a good goal to have. And although it is a lot more than the 0.009 Bitcoin, over time it is an attainable goal still at these prices. Now, just to cover all of our bases, let's cover a really pessimistic scenario in which Bitcoin adoption really slows down and we only ever get to 1% total global adoption. Let's consider the future scenario where we go from the 50 million users of Bitcoin we have today to in the future having 80 million users of Bitcoin, which would represent 1% of the total global population. This would also be an extreme slowdown in Bitcoin's adoption. Let me remind you that crypto in general is currently being adopted at a faster pace than the internet, so to see Bitcoin adoption slow down this bad would really be a black swan event and it would be extremely unlikely. But in this scenario, with 80 million people globally wanting Bitcoin and assuming an even split amongst everyone, each person could only accumulate a maximum of around 0.21 Bitcoin. This goal of accumulating 0.21 Bitcoin is a great goal to have once you pass the 0.1 Bitcoin mark. And again, I want to stress in all these scenarios, it's assuming an even split of the Bitcoin supply amongst every holder. In reality, there's always going to be whale holders like Michael Saylor who hold hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin, so the actual amount of Bitcoin each individual could realistically get to would actually be much lower. But these are all just various reframes to show investors that it's definitely not too late, you haven't missed the boat on Bitcoin, and owning just a fraction of a Bitcoin is significant and a big deal. Finally, let's talk about wealth distribution across the globe to really highlight the scarcity of Bitcoin. The best way I believe to do this is by looking at the total amount of millionaires there are around the world. According to various analyses, there's an estimated 59 million millionaires all around the world. And out of the total global population, if you are a millionaire, you are well in the top 1% of wealth globally. So we know there's roughly 59 million millionaires all around the globe. We also know that there's only a maximum available 17 million Bitcoin. If every single one of these millionaires wanted exposure to Bitcoin and wanted to buy it, if it was evenly split amongst all of them, they could only accumulate 0.3559 Bitcoin each, which, when you think about it, is actually insane and really highlights the scarcity of Bitcoin. Now, all of these scenarios are of course hypothetical, but I'm trying to highlight just one thing. Bitcoin is the first thing that humans have created that has true, verifiable scarcity. Many people compared Bitcoin scarcity to gold scarcity, but in reality, they're nothing alike. Bitcoin scarcity is provable and verifiable, whereas gold is actually uncertain. We actually don't know how much gold there is on Earth, and there's actually gold floating around on different planets and asteroids in space. And when the price of gold goes up, there's a lot more investment into gold miners and technology that increases the rate we can pull gold out of the earth. The inflation rate of gold actually goes up. The scarcity of gold is in fact changeable. Then, if you look at other investments compared to Bitcoin, such as stocks or real estate, they are not scarce in the slightest. If a company's stock price goes up enough, they can always issue new shares, split the stock, or dilute holders, so stocks are not scarce in the slightest. If house prices go up, they can always build new houses. Bitcoin is the only true scarce desirable asset, and I hope by highlighting these various different scenarios, it shows just how scarce it really is. Another point that is important to make is that Bitcoin holders are fanatical to the point they are almost religious about Bitcoin, and this is unlike every other asset. There are many fanatical Bitcoiners who are just going to buy Bitcoin, and on top of this, they are never going to sell. A good example of this is someone like Michael Saylor. Saylor's company, MicroStrategy, currently holds over 226,000 Bitcoin. Then, Saylor himself personally holds over 17,000 Bitcoin, meaning just Saylor by himself has orchestrated the purchasing of over 243,000 Bitcoin. If we compare this to our previously worked out total available supply of Bitcoin, which was at 17 million coins, Saylor alone has taken off over 1.5% of the total Bitcoin supply, and he has said time and time again that he is never selling. There are millions and millions investors worldwide, myself included, who are going to do exactly what Saylor has done here, just on a smaller scale. They're going to keep buying Bitcoin with no intention of ever selling. Another example of this is the Bitcoin ETFs, which launched earlier this year. Right now, they hold over 864,000 Bitcoin, which is a number that is only going to go up. The type of investors that are buying the Bitcoin ETF are not short-term investors, but they're sophisticated investors who plan on holding it for the long term. The Bitcoin ETFs in the USA alone, and they've only been operating for 6 months now, have already scooped up over 5% of the total available 17 million Bitcoin supply. So, as you can see, it doesn't take much for huge chunks of the Bitcoin supply to be removed from the circulating supply to be held for the long term or potentially forever. Already, we're seeing companies who have seen the massive success MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor has had with their Bitcoin strategy, and they're replicating it for themselves. For example, a US public listed biotech called Semler Scientific announced last month they had bought 828 Bitcoin for nearly 60 million US, with plans on raising $150 million to buy more. Very quickly, you can see that whales can buy up and completely remove huge chunks of the Bitcoin circulating supply. And more wealthy individuals and even nations are catching on to this. For example, last month, Michael Dell, the 10th richest person in the world and majority owner of Dell Computers, started bull posting about Bitcoin on Twitter. First, he tweeted out scarcity creates value. Then, he retweeted Michael Saylor's response, Bitcoin is digital scarcity. He then tweeted out a picture of the Cookie Monster eating Bitcoin. Michael Dell is the 10th richest person in the world and is worth over $100 billion, and Dell Computers has over $6 billion worth of cash on their balance sheet, which is losing its value day by day due to inflation. Although Michael Dell hasn't publicly confirmed that he or Dell Computers is buying Bitcoin, all the smoke signals are there. Another good example of whales buying up the Bitcoin supply is El Salvador, with El Salvador having bought $360 million worth of Bitcoin, and they've committed to buying 1 Bitcoin per day into the future. It's not just rich individuals and companies that are buying up the Bitcoin supply, but now nations themselves are doing it as well. All of this is just to show one true point. It doesn't take much to remove huge chunks of Bitcoin's available supply. This means small fractions of a Bitcoin are in fact significant and will become more significant into the future. Finally, as promised, I wanted to finish on a realistic Bitcoin price prediction over the next 10 to 20 years that you can expect. And I think this price prediction not only highlights the scarcity of Bitcoin, but also goes to show why a fraction of a Bitcoin will be extremely significant into the future. So part of my job is getting to interview the best and brightest investors in the space. As such, I always get to ask them what's their realistic prediction for Bitcoin over the next 10 to 20 years. And surprisingly, of all the smartest and most accomplished investors that I have asked, they've all essentially given me the exact same answer. From Michael Saylor, who has made billions investing in Bitcoin, to astrophysicist Giovanni Santastasi, to mathematician Fred Krueger, or renowned investor Larry Lepard, they've all told me that a realistic Bitcoin price appreciation over the next 10 years would be roughly 40% compounded annually. This also is roughly what the Bitcoin Power Law model predicts, which, if you haven't heard of it yet, it's the most accurate Bitcoin pricing model with over a 99% accuracy rate so far. Now, 40% compounded annually doesn't seem like an insane growth rate, but compounded over time, it actually is. Keep in mind the stock market has only compounded at a rate of 7% annually. An asset compounding at 40% yearly is actually insane. To illustrate how big this really is, $10,000 invested in Bitcoin today, compounded at an annual growth rate of 40% in 10 years' time, would be worth $290,000. Then, if it continues for the next 10 years after that, that original $10,000 invested in Bitcoin after 20 years would be worth just under $8.4 million. That is nuts, and you can see why Albert Einstein famously once said, "Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world." Now, I wanted to break all of this down to drive one point home: you have not missed the boat on Bitcoin, and it really is still early. Let me know in the comments below, what's your magic number for Bitcoin? Are you trying to get to 0.009 Bitcoin? Have you already made it to 0.1 Bitcoin? Or have you already surpassed the huge feat of becoming a whole coiner? Finally, guys, if you have watched this deep into the video, you're clearly interested in Bitcoin and crypto. If you want to do yourself a quick 10-second favor, be sure to go to the first link in the description and sign up for my daily email called the Crypto Nutshell. It's a completely free email that myself, alongside a team of on-chain analysts, writes every single morning. It only takes 5 minutes to read, and it covers all the breaking news in Bitcoin and crypto, top expert predictions, and the top on-chain analysis that you need to know. Take 10 seconds right now to click that first link in the description, enter your email, and you'll start receiving our email in your inbox every single morning. It's an easy read and only takes 5 minutes to read. Anyway, guys, that's all for today's video. I hope it did bring you some value. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all in the next one, and as always, all the best. Bitcoin, 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 Bitcoin. Shut up. Shut up!